So we covered some foundational items in our first session. I'm not going to go over those again. The study handout page that you picked up in the back kind of just gives a general outline of that. But we do have a couple of text verses, one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament. I would encourage you to read those yourself, especially the one in Habakkuk. Just read it real slowly. And there's a lot in there. It's one of those books that's overlooked. A lot of people don't even know where to find it. I see a few of you turning there, so I may as well just turn there and read it real quick. We'll let you read the one in Acts by yourself. So a book like Habakkuk, you're thinking to yourself, here's normally the way I think. Is it between Jeremiah and Daniel, or is it after Daniel? And, so because you always know where Daniel is, you always know where Isaiah is, so then you kind of build from there. But Habakkuk, if it helps you, it's right after Nahum. Probably no help to you. Habakkuk chapter 2, and I've kind of taken the first verse as my personal theme, but each of us can have this as kind of a theme in these end times of I will stand my watch. It's kind of a military idea. It's kind of a guard over a walled city. He's standing there looking out, seeing if any enemies are coming, any danger of any type. It's kind of a sometimes lonely position. He might be there all by himself, but it's an important position. It's a vital position for the safety of the town. So I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me. So that's kind of our role in life, is to stand guard in the position he's placed us in and listen for his voice. And until he speaks to us, we just stand there. And what I will answer when I am reproved. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tables. So the Lord answered finally, and the answer was, I want you to write the vision I'm going to give you, but I want you to make it plain. And I think that's one reason why a lot of people are afraid of a study of eschatology, is a lot of Bible teachers that I watch on the internet or I watch live, I read their books. Sometimes you get the feeling that they're just trying to impress people. How much they know the Greek and Hebrew, how many verses they have memorized, how they can diagram all of the end time events, and often using language that is really only known to other end time so-called experts. But the end times, even though it's a large, sometimes confusing subject, the Lord says in this place, I want you to make it plain. So that's my goal in these lessons, make it as clear as possible. And then the goal of those who hear it after we speak it is that he may run who reads it. So there's like an idea of it excites them. They just want to run with it, go tell others. And the end times really should be that way. It's really interesting. It's exciting. It's motivating. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, which is an important subject in the Bible, God's appointed times. But at the end, it will speak and it will not lie. So it is the truth, though it tarries and it seems like it has. A lot of us grew up in church work. We heard all of our life the Lord could come anytime. Certainly he's going to come within our lifetime, certainly in the next decade. We just heard it so often that it kind of runs off our back. But it's purposely designed to be impending, whether it's imminent or not. It's always impending, meaning most every generation could rightly think it might happen in their lifetime. But now many lifetimes have gone by and it still hasn't happened yet. So it tarries. Wait for it. So that's the only advice, just be patient. It's going to happen, because it goes on to say, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. In other words, when it does happen, it will happen quickly. And we're going to find a lot of verses that speak to that. So tonight we're going to start off by asking three big questions. Why study eschatology? I get that said to me quite a bit in my ministry. Why should I study eschatology? A lot of people avoid studying it. Preachers avoid preaching it. It's a real common attitude, by the way, of avoiding eschatology. And that's a big mistake. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, it just causes strife, causes debates, people argue about it, and I don't like that in church. Or they'll say things like, it'll all pan out in the end. So I just don't want to really get too involved in it. But when someone says, it's so complex and so confusing and it causes debates and strife, why should I even study it? My response would be, is that a problem with the Bible, or is that a problem with that person? Because God takes up a lot of space in his word about eschatology. I've read a variety of percentages, but usually it is said that there is about half a dozen times more scriptures about what we call eschatology, his second coming, than there are about his first coming. I'm talking about in the Old Testament. And you just start reading through the prophet books and you'll see there's a whole lot more in there about the end times, we call it, than there is about his first coming. So why study eschatology? Well, God thinks it's important enough to put a lot in the Bible about it, so we should think it's important as well. It's not a side issue. It's not even a separate issue from other subjects. Eschatology is a general subject that weaves itself in and out of other doctrines, connected to salvation, connected to service. And so I like to tell people something like this. It sometimes preachers especially, and I usually consider this like false humility. A preacher will stand up and say, I just don't want to know anything else but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Okay, that's fine. What's involved in the death and resurrection of Christ? Are the things of his return connected to his crucifixion? Yes, they are. Many of the things about his return were part of the price he paid on the cross, so that the events of his return are dependent upon his death and resurrection. In other words, his death and resurrection set in motion a series of events that will not be completed until after his return. So a person says, I just want Christ and him crucified. Okay, that means you have to preach on the end times because it's connected to it. What I like to say also is that Christ's death and resurrection launched God's renewal project. And the text in Acts 3 really describes God's renewal project, whom heaven must receive until the time of restoration of all things. The songbook we use here, Celebration Hymnal, it has a lot of, good one-verse songs, good praise songs, and I like most all of them. but I'm glad it also includes a lot of the old gospel hymns. You know, the old gospel hymns, the 3 or 4 verses or whatever they are, they tell a story. And so many of them start out like Amazing Grace, has saved a wretch like me. So the first verse is talking about my lost condition, my need of a Savior. And then it talks about ongoing grace throughout my life. But many of them, the last verse talks about the return of Christ. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. So it tells a complete story from start to finish. And the last verse is often about something about the return of Christ. So yeah, it is a difficult and complex study, but it must be done if we're going to study the Bible. If you're going to study the Bible, you're going to study eschatology. That's just how it is. The second question, what benefits are there to a study of eschatology? And I thought of at least 5. Maybe we'll look at these verses real quick. The first one is 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. You can use this in talking to others if they bring up the idea, what benefit is there to studying eschatology? Well, one, Peter says in 1 Peter 4:7, but the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be serious and watchful in your prayers. So one benefit of studying eschatology is a deeper prayer life. If you really study eschatology and the events leading up to the return of Christ and the actual story of the return of Christ, don't you think it has a positive effect on your prayer life? The second, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 11, therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? So the second benefit is deeper conduct. So in other words, a study of the end times is intended to have a present effect in our life. 2 Peter 3:14, therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, without spot and blameless. A deeper relationship with Christ. So a person says, I'm saved. All I want to know is Jesus and him crucified. I don't want to study the end times. Too confusing. People like to argue about it. Don't you want to have a deeper relationship with Christ? What can help that more than studying about the glorious return and the setting up of his kingdom and him being king and all the blessings that he's going to bring on the earth? So it draws you closer to him. And then a fourth benefit of studying the end times is to avoid deception. This is becoming more important in my thinking. I mean, wouldn't we all agree that right now we are seeing deception by our national and global leaders more every day as they double and triple down on their deception about everything? And so Jesus in Matthew 24, we'll see it more closely when we get to that chapter, 4 times he said, be not deceived. When they brought up all of their questions about when shall these things be and the sign of your return and the destruction of the temple, he almost ignored their questions at first. His very first words out of his mouth, see that you be not deceived. As I often say here at Liberty, deception is not really good deception unless it deceives people. It is so close to the truth that the vast majority accept it as the truth, even though it's a lie. Really good deception can trap just about everyone. Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians that the ministers of Satan are able to present themselves as angels of light. So if you see an angel of light, it's beautiful and it's clear and it's just everything good about it. And yet it's a minister of Satan. So avoid deception. The more you study the end times, the less likely you are to be deceived when it all starts coming to pass. And then the fifth thing I thought of is prophecy as evangelism. I don't know why there's not more of this. You read the early chapters of Acts. What were their main texts in their evangelistic sermons? The day of Pentecost, what was it? Joel chapter 2, a prophecy about the future. Psalm 110, verse 1. He started it with Joel 2. His final, right before the invitation, we might call it, is Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. And so Peter built his whole evangelistic message on Pentecost on prophetic scriptures. Our text verse in Acts 3 was his next great sermon, and it's prophetic. And you start reading through Acts, and many of their great sermons that caused the conversion of a lot of people were prophetic scriptures. So it's a very powerful evangelistic tool. Then the third question, how do we know if we are in the end times? And that's an easy one to answer, isn't it? So I wrote these verses here using the Greek word telos, which means end or goal or culmination. And these are some places where it's used. We read the one in 1 Peter 4:7. The end of all things is at hand. So that Paul could say in Hebrews 1:2 that in these last days, God speaks to us through his Son. Last and end. How do we know? We often say the end times began with the death and resurrection of Christ. There's a passage, maybe we'll just read it right now, in Daniel chapter 12. This is a really good one to point out to people about that time called the Great Tribulation and how it is connected to the resurrection of the dead. At that time, chapter 12, verse 1, Michael shall stand up. On your own, we'll get to it eventually, but think of the connection between Daniel 12 and Revelation 12. Because this says Michael stands up. But why is he standing up? Revelation 12 deals with that. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against Lucifer and his angels, and Lucifer was cast down to the earth, and he was very angry because he knows that he has a short time. That happens during the Great Tribulation. And that's when he completely empowers the man of sin, the Antichrist. And so one way to say it, comparing Daniel 12 and Revelation 12, is when Daniel stands up, Satan is cast out, cast down to the earth. And so we know we're in the tribulation time because he goes on to say that when Michael stands up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, there shall be a time of trouble, tribulation, such as never was since there was a nation even to that time, the great tribulation. So not just general tribulation, the last great tribulation. Jeremiah 30 and verse 7 calls it the time of Jacob's trouble. But it's not restricted to Jacob, is it? Many people say that because it's called the time of Jacob's trouble, it's only for Israel. So I like to point out to people Is it not a time of trouble for everyone on the earth, not just the Jews? So it is a special focus on them, but it's for everyone. At that time, your people should be delivered. So somewhere connected to this great tribulation, such as never was, Israel is going to be delivered. And we know that's at the return of Christ. Everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And we have to go into the New Testament to find out that those are two separate resurrections separated by 1,000 years. You can't see it in this verse, but many in the New Testament clarify that. But my point in reading these two verses is that the resurrection of the dead is after a time of great tribulation. So it's a future event. But what Jesus did in his own resurrection is he reached out into the future, a resurrection of the dead, pulled it back into the present in his experience when he rose from the dead. And so we know that's why in 1 Corinthians 15, a couple of places he's called the first fruits of the resurrection. He was first, and then Paul goes on to say, and then those who are Christ at his coming. So he was separated off in time from the end time resurrection of the dead in his own resurrection. So that's why the writers of the New Testament could say, we are in the end times, in these last days, because it was triggered by him taking an end time event and bringing it back into his own experience. I'm going to skip some parts of my notes because I want to get to some good stuff here. There's some marvelous passages in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that show what I call a sweeping look. And it takes like the whole Bible and compresses it into a short passage, especially the two comings of Christ. Acts 3:18 through 21 does that. So it talks about his suffering. It talks about him going back to heaven until the times of restoration of all things. So both comings in one passage, all tied together in a short space. But what I want to do tonight, I'm going to have to turn this around. Did not flip the board over to do my writing, and so if I flipped it over, everything would be upside down. So I'll do better next time. So there are some wonderful passages that give this like sweeping look. And I want to look at Hosea chapter 5 and chapter 6 a little bit tonight, because this is going to like give structure or framework to the first verse that we're going to look at as we start going sequentially in the New Testament, looking at eschatology verses. Matthew 2:6 will be our first one, and it's a quote from Micah chapter 5. But this passage in, let me find it real quick. Where is it connected to Daniel? Right after Daniel. Hosea chapter 5. This is an amazing passage. I don't know of a passage that gives a better detailed overall look at both comings of Christ. Look at the language in it. So Hosea 5, starting in verse 14. I will be like a lion to Ephraim. Okay, a reference to Christ as the lion. He came as a king, a lion, but he also came as a lion, kind of a king of the forest, beast idea, to Israel, to Judah. I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear them. But you go down to chapter 6 and verse 1, for he has torn. So he's going to tear, but at some point he has torn. Now, when did this tearing happen? Remember, John the Baptist said in Matthew 3 and 12 that the winnowing fan is in his hand, and he will gather the wheat into his barn, but he will take the chaff and burn it with unquenchable fire. So a sifting within Israel of the wheat and the chaff. And that's exactly what his ministry was about. John the Baptist's ministry was about that. But there's a tearing. And at the end of his ministry, after he tried and tried and tried miracles and sermons and all sorts of wonderful things, he wept over Jerusalem in his triumphal entry, the few days leading up to his crucifixion. He wept over that city and said, "Your house is left unto you desolate." He tore them. They were torn away from their Messiah. He pronounced judgment on them because of their rejection of him. What does it say then? I will tear them, and look at this, and go away. Are you thinking of John 14? I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go, I will come again and receive you to myself. John 17, Father, receive me back to the glory I had with you before the world began. He was going back to his place. Where is his place? At the right hand of the Father. So I will tear them and go away. I will take them away, and no one shall rescue. That's the dispersion of the last 2,000 years. They had a 40-year period of testing from his death to 70 AD. 40 is the number of testing. So he gave him like an extra 40 years after his personal ministry. So all through Acts, you keep seeing the apostles repeat this little phrase, to the Jew first. You know, we still have this really important mission to the Jews. God was giving them 40 years to turn to their Messiah. And many of them did, individuals, the vast majority did not. 70 AD, he lowered the hammer. And then in 132, there was another revolt under a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba, which is when they really got pushed out of their country into the other nations. I will take them away, and no one shall rescue them. What other people group in the history of the human race has been scattered to the nations, and then 2,000 years later, they come back and form a country again? Impossible. He says, I will return again to my place. There, John 14 again, the right hand of the Father. And look at this next statement, till. Last time I mentioned the importance of untils and tills. Circle it every time you see it. It's really important. It's like a hinge. Something is hinging right there. There's going to be a gap of time. There's going to be a delay. There's going to be a change of things happening until a certain time in the future. It's a real important trigger word. I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their offense. Singular offense. Everyone sins. Israel had a particular offense. And what was that offense? Well, we could look at a number of verses. One would be, we already quoted Matthew 23:38. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. 37 says, I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. What was their great offense? Their great offense was when God spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him, hear him." And they didn't hear it. There's a word in Hebrew called Shema. It's a pretty famous idea, especially if you're Jewish. It simply means to listen or to hear. And the great Shema that they pray every day is Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And then it's a number of verses they pray after that. All through the Old Testament, the single most important charge God made against Israel was, "You won't listen to me," which means to pay attention. It means to listen and then obey. It's kind of like when we say to our kids, "Listen to me now." We don't mean just hear the words, we mean obey. And so you were not willing was their great offense, which led to, when Jesus said, "You were not willing, your house is left unto you desolate," it was just a couple of days later when Pilate said, "What shall I do with your king?" And they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Why? He's your king." And they said, "We have no king but Caesar." That was their official apostasy. They signed the document, you might say. We have officially rejected our God and his Son. And so that's their great offense. Till they acknowledge their offense. When will they acknowledge their offense? They haven't acknowledged it for 2,000 years. When will they acknowledge their offense? Keep your finger here and go over to Zechariah chapter 12. In verse 10, "I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me, whom they pierced, and they will mourn." Now, this is quoted in John's gospel at the crucifixion of Christ. They looked on him whom they pierced, but they did not repent at that point. They didn't weep. It didn't change them. When he comes back, they're going to look on him whom they pierced, Zechariah 12:10, and they will mourn. And then it goes on to talk about everyone is going to weep. That's a sign of repentance. And so, because of their repentance, chapter 13, verse 1, "In that day," when? When they look on him whom they pierced, "a fountain shall be opened for the house of David, for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and uncleanness." And they're going to ask down in verse 6, "What are these wounds in your hands?" And he'll say, "Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends," his own people. So when will they acknowledge their offense? When they see him in the sky. When he comes back, chapter 14 of Zechariah in verse 4, his feet stands on the Mount of Olives, and they go through into safety. But by that point, back in chapter 13 and verse 8, "It shall come to pass in all the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 in it shall be cut off and die, but 1/3 shall be left in it. And I will bring the 1/3 through the fire, will refine them as silver is refined, test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, 'This is my people,' and each one will say, 'The Lord is my God.'" So 1/3 of Israel will be spared when Jesus comes back, and they will be saved as a group, all at once, instantaneous. Someone might say, yeah, but that doesn't sound very merciful of God. 2/3 of them died. Well, I guess one response would be 1/3's a lot of Jews for God to save in a moment. That's a lot. So 2/3 of them don't make it through. So it's going to be a brutal time for them. But a special revelation of Christ returning is going to open their eyes, and their heart is going to be broken, and they're going to be saved. So Hosea says, I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face in their affliction. The word affliction is the same word as tribulation. At the end of the great tribulation, they will seek the face of Christ. They will diligently seek me. Come and let us return to the Lord. This is their response when they seek his face. For he has torn, but he will heal us, and he does. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. And then here's something you might think I'm conjecturing too much or making too much out of it, but if you're following the flow of this prophecy, I think it really fits. After 2 days. After 2 days from what? I think it's referring back to verse 14, when I go away. So 2 days after he goes away, he's coming back, and they will seek his face. So I put these numbers up here, try to make a little bit of sense out of this. I think most of us agree that there's something there about the original 7 days of creation. And that in a real sense, 6 days are for man, and the seventh day rest is the millennial, the seventh period of 1,000 years. So in Bible language, or in Bible years at least, we have 4 days, 4,000 years from Adam to Christ. And we're living in the 2 days that this is talking about. He's gone back to his place. Now we're living out the 2 days. The Bible calls it the times of the Gentiles. And we're just about to the end of the 2 days. We're not date setters. We just don't do that. That's a fool's game. But Christ probably died about 30 AD. So we're just about to the end of the 2 days. So, some of that's variable. It doesn't mean it's exactly the minute that the 2,000 years are over, but very well could be close. So if we break it down just a little bit more, we got 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham, Moses, David, and Zerubbabel, the return from Babylon. So each of those are 500 years apart. And so all 4 of those periods of 500 years adds up to another 2,000. So that's where the 4 days comes in. I find it interesting. God is so precise that a period of 500 years is 10 jubilees. Leviticus 25 talks about the Jubilee year. So every 50th year was a Jubilee year. Slaves got set free, land came back to the original owners, peace and prosperity is a special Sabbath. Jubilees were great years. So you have 10 Jubilees every period of 500. So 10 Jubilees from Abraham to Moses, 10 more from Moses to David, 10 more from David to Zerubbabel, and then 10 more from Zerubbabel to Christ. But then every period of 2,000 years then would be 40 jubilees. As Andy's dad used to say, this is no coincidence, it's a coinkydink. It just is a little bit too much for coincidence. 40 is a number of testing. So you have 40 jubilees in the first 2,000 years. That's the time of the family, the institution of the family. That ended in the judgment of the flood. Then he raised up another family of Abraham. So that's the first 2,000 years where God's focus was on the family unit. And they failed. But he raised up a godly family with Abraham, and the promises continued. The second set of 2,000 years is the family of Abraham that developed into the nation of Israel. They were tested, the number 40, and they didn't pass the test. So I don't know what to conclude. I mean, there are many eschatology teachers that hold to what's called the post-millennial view. And that's a teaching that the church will finally succeed in winning the world over to the gospel, where the family in Israel failed. And so it's called a view of victory. You know, the premillennial view says things are going to get worse and worse, and it's going to take the intervention of Christ to put a stop to evil. And we are to carry out the Great Commission. We are to preach the gospel. But I also conclude that in many ways, the number 40 of the church age, the last 2,000 years, the church may well have failed the test. The church will be here when Christ comes back. Israel will be here when Christ comes back. The family will be here when Christ comes back. All of God's institutions are perpetual, meaning once they were started by God, they will be here when Christ comes back. The family unit will be beaten up and battered, barely surviving, but it'll be here. Israel the same, beaten and battered, but still here. The church the same, beaten and battered, but still here. God's promise is sure. But to say that somehow the church will come along and do everything perfect that the family in Israel didn't and win the world over to Christ, I like the optimism in it, but I don't see it in the Bible. So we're nearing the end of the 2 days. He goes on to say here in Hosea, after 2 days, which I say is after he's gone back to his place, what happens? He will revive us, the resurrection, on the third day. So you got the 2 days and the third day after he's gone to his place. So that's why it's easy to move back from the 2 days and the third day to the 4 days leading up to it. So I don't think I'm trying to do too much with this. On the third day, he will raise us up, the resurrection, that we may live in his sight. As a result, then, after he revives us and raises us up, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord is going forth, is established. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter former rain to the earth. So that's Hosea 5:14 through 6:3. I think it fits. I'm comfortable with it. It took me a lot of years to even work my way through it because it's tucked away in this little prophet book, and you got to really just stop and think about every part of it. It just really hit me over the head one day several years ago. This is a prophecy about both comings of Christ, and it's an outline of all of prophecy, is what this passage is. And so this time of in their affliction, it says in verse 15, so this is the great tribulation, the 7 years, the mentioned in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, and we'll get into all that eventually. I put Matthew 24:15 right in the middle of those 7 years, because that's when Jesus said, go to Daniel and study about the abomination of desolation. So evidently Jesus is telling us that abomination of desolation that happens in the middle of the 7 years, when the Antichrist declares himself God, sits in the temple and declares it, puts an end to the peace agreement, the contract that he signed in the beginning. In my mind, the way all this is going to play out is that because of some major trouble in the world, whether it be a virus, something worse than what we're going through now, probably will include a war, either regional or worldwide, and he will be able to come along and broker peace. And there'll be a lot of opposition to it by the Muslim countries probably, except they've probably just had the stuffing beat out of them. And so, as their normal way is, we'll sign the peace treaty to be able to build back for future war. And so they'll agree to it. Israel will be tired. I mean, Israel doesn't like war. Who likes war? So they're going to say, yeah, okay. So probably something along the line of, because there's so many different ideas, let's all agree to a 7-year period. Lay down your arms, and then after 7 years, we'll have a better picture of this whole thing, and we'll change it then. But as we will see eventually in these lessons, all the while, that's not his real plan. His real plan is to use this 7-year agreement to gain control and power, and his real goal is to annihilate Israel. But she was in the driver's seat, probably in the outcome of this war, so he can't do it at the beginning, so he agrees to a treaty of some sort, intends to break it whenever he can, whenever he has enough power, which will be in the middle, and he's going to come along at some point and say, yeah, I know what we signed, but I'm in power now and you're not, and you're going to succumb to me or die. And that's the abomination of desolation. That's the same time when Michael casts out Satan in Revelation 12, and he's cast to the earth, and he embodies his man on the earth. So that's why the last half of the 7 years is called the Great Tribulation, because finally Satan and his man are united, kind of an incarnation scene, just like Jesus was an incarnation of God. The Antichrist will be an incarnation of Satan, and Satan will be working through him to cause as much damage as possible. That's why the last half is really called the Great Tribulation. Revelation 7 and 14 in the original language, the Greek language, it has two definite articles: the tribulation, the great one. That's where we really get the idea of the Great Tribulation. Revelation 7:14, and then the seventh day rest is the 1,000 years. Let me see, I have just a couple more minutes. I'll open it up for comments and questions. I did want to go back to Habakkuk and just close out my part with this idea of an appointed time. So in start of verse 3, for the vision is yet for an appointed time. God has a timetable. Now, I just put it out in these 2 days and third day, 7 days, and these jubilees, and in the 70th week of Daniel. But all of these are my attempt to just show that the truth, God has a timetable. and it's going to be worked out on God's timetable. And it's going to be this weird combination of the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of godliness, bumping heads all along the way, working side by side, both of them reaching their climatic point at the end of the tribulation, where the man of sin is going to be able to kill the two witnesses. He's going to be able to sway the whole world, set up an economic system. Satan looks like he has control of things finally on the earth. And then in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the sky bursts open, and Christ comes back on his white horse, and a great sword goes out of his mouth, and he smites the nations, and he grabs Antichrist by his collar, throws him into the lake of fire, and it's over. Just about that quick. So it's going to appear that the schedule of the Antichrist is being played out. The 7-year treaty breaks it halfway through. It's like he's in charge of the whole schedule. No, God's in charge of the whole schedule. And God's working in that to bring about the culmination at the return of Christ. So in the New Testament, this appointed time, there's a phrase used in the New Testament several places, in due time. In due time, Christ was born of a woman, born under the law. That's Galatians 4. In Romans 5, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. So you put those two verses together, Christ was born on God's schedule, exactly at the right time. He died on God's schedule, exactly on the right day, Passover. So God is in control of it all, even though it doesn't always look like it. And I'll eventually get into some of the feast days, the spring feast days, the fall feast days, and how that those are God's calendar as he works out his plan. The spring feast days are in connection to Christ's first coming. The fall feast days in connection to Christ's second coming. The middle one, Pentecost, is wonderful because it looks back at what he did in his first coming and looks forward to what he's going to do in his second coming. It kind of ties them together. That's one of the purposes of Pentecost, being right in the middle of those. So I'm going to close out my part. I think I'm going to stop this recording part of it and open it up to you, whatever you want to say. Questions, comments? Rick? Yes.
I have one comment, one question. Like pasta. The last couple days I've been thinking about tonight.
About time?
About tonight. And
tonight.
Jesus says, when I come again, will I even find faith? It's almost a rhetorical question. Christ is asking, will I even find faith? But for the sake of the elect, I will shorten those days. To me, that just screams of major deception. I mean, we feel like oddballs now in a lot of ways in this world, but I don't think we've seen anything yet. As the mass media and the United Kingdoms of the world, we see what's happening in Canada today, Australia, going dark. And Jesus is saying, well, you can find faith. And so, as I think of that, and I think about the need to do what we do tonight, study the Bible and meet together and to share our faith, I think it's very good. That's my comment. My question, I've heard a lot of theologians for the last few years preach the pre-trib position, which in my terminology has three terms of Christ, okay? But David Jeremiah, this great Christian apologist, he says where Christians make the mistake is that they confuse the pre-trib coming of Christ and then at the end, the advent of Jesus. Now, I wasn't really quite familiar with that kind of terminology about him making a difference between an advent and a coming. Question, are they not the same thing?
They are to me. But the pre-tribulation rapture position is that he doesn't come all the way to the earth in that we meet him in the sky and then make a U-turn and go back to heaven. And marriage takes place, the rewarding takes place during the 7 years while the Great Tribulation is going on earth. I don't hold that position, but many good people do. So we don't really make it a test of fellowship. But I take Revelation 1:7 for exactly what it says, that he is coming in the clouds, and every eye shall see him. So it's not a secret coming. It's the only coming described in Revelation. It's an every eye visible coming. And therefore, I don't make a difference in those two words. The coming is the word parousia, and it means actually arrival. He's arriving. The king has arrived to the city, to the people. They go out to meet him, but then they turn around and come back with him to celebrate. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about that right now.
That creates several problems. But if you had a pre-tribulation arrival, and then you have those that are alive to be caught up and meet him, and if they say they go somewhere for 7 years and have the marriage of the Lamb, do they receive their glorified bodies at the first of the tribulation versus the end, as opposed to the post-trib, which I take, he comes down in the arrows, the clouds, and we that are alive will be caught up to meet him, and then the dead Christ will rise first, and then he comes down from the clouds. I believe Zechariah says he will tramp the blood. He'll come as a lion, and that will be with him, and what part we'll play in the destruction of nations. Your imagination can really run wild with that. But I see a disharmony in the scripture if you have the pre-tribulation and the resurrection verses.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points that can be brought up, and we will eventually. But there will be tribulation saints. Book of Revelation clearly describes tribulation saints. So sometimes things are said like, he loves his church too much to let them go through the tribulation. It sounds good, but then think, well, so he loves the saints before the tribulation more than he loves the tribulation saints? Because tribulation saints get brutalized and beheaded. Just terrible what they have to go through. And yet they're still called saints. So those kind of arguments don't hold a lot of weight to me.
And Rick, I hope you get to this point. Traditionally speaking, I have been first to believe that 70th week of Daniel, the first of the 3.5 piece. The second half was the tribulation of the Antichrist. Mm-hmm. But I was kind of schooled to think that the wrath of God is rather on top of the last 3.5 years, and the wrath of the Antichrist both going on at the same time. Yeah. But I have kind of modified that, and I can be corrected on that. Hopefully, you can weigh in on that later. I see the Antichrist wrath. I see the coming of Christ at the end, and his wrath begins, and maybe the first 3.5 years, or what we consider the millennial reign, would be God's wrath following the Antichrist wrath. Two separate time frames. So I don't know if I throw that out.
And a lot of that is dependent on the relationship between the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls of wrath. Do they each follow each other? Do the 7 seals complete themselves before the 7 trumpets start? Are they completed before the 7 bowls of wrath? I have them mixed in together quite a bit. But even then, only, the whole thing might be considered God's wrath in some sense, but the only thing that is called God's wrath are the 7 bowls of wrath. And they seem to be very concentrated, either right at the end of the 7 years, or in your case, you bring it over into after his coming. But yeah, God's wrath and Antichrist's wrath certainly can operate side by side, and we're trying to get all that sorted out.
Doesn't it mention 3 different sets of days? Like if it's where I read it was 1260, then it was 1290, and it was 1335.
Yeah, the 3.5 years would be 1260 days, 42 months, times half the time. And then the end of the book of Daniel brings in a 1290 and a 1335. Right? Yeah, so there's going to be something beyond the 1260 at his return. Blessed is he who comes to the 1335, which may just simply be it takes the extra 45 days or 75 days for him to really establish his role as king. It may be when things start settling down as far as everyone knows what this is all about. He's come back, he's declaring himself king, and no one's going to be able to stop him. Some people say that's when the marriage takes place at the end of the 1335, that extension of time. We're not really told. So we kind of conjecture some a little bit this.
So the last contributions cannot show in the miracle of like demonic.
Why did you do that last
The
word?
triumphant tribulations cannot show in the demonic experience.
Demonic, of course, yes. Yeah, there's more spiritual activity of the spirit world, both good and bad, in the book of Revelation than anywhere in the Bible. As I like to say, that there's a reason why so much demonic activity is described in the Gospels when Jesus was here, is that he's a magnet. Anywhere Jesus is, evil is going to be at its worst, or attempted worst. So a lot of demonic activity when he was here. And so the same thing about a second coming, building up to a second coming, demonic activity is going to increase greatly. But there's also going to be like 2 witnesses. There's indications of good angels doing major things throughout the book of Revelation as well. So this side by side, good and evil both building toward a climax.
It's also very interesting as you dissect these numbers, that God is a God of patterns, like you said. It's not coincidence. These things are on timetable. And as I look at the reign or the ministry of Jesus, the first 3.5 happened before his crucifixion. And upon his return, and if you go to the days of Daniel, to me that fits pretty tight. 7 years ministry of Jesus, 3.5 before, 3.5.
I think I've been trying to force myself lately to, when I hear things like you mentioned about when God let the saints go through tribulation, doesn't he love the saints? I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't at least try to start allowing ourselves to be conformed to the image of God, even in our minds, to where we look at the end time events through God's lens. Because of every comment that we hear, I hear about why would God allow this, is from the human viewpoint only. I would hold that somebody like Stephen, who got stoned in very high esteem, and many would say he was stoned to death, he was killed, and he was, but just like Christ was killed. But in real terms, he gave up his life. Stephen was stoned, but did God say, your race is over, I'm delivering you at this point? So was the deliverance through God's lens becomes completed with race, where it was murdered by the hand of those choose. My point being is the tribulation and what will happen in people suffering caused by the Christ, the saints that will die during that time will be martyrs. In the eyes of God, will be looking, just like Stephen did, looking up and seeing Christ at the right hand of the Father, saying, "Come here, deliver to them." So it can almost be, looking through God's lens, it's, you now get to come. Instead of you had to suffer and give up the world. And the conditions of the world can be such at that time where we really going to be holding on to it so much that, recently, a young man called me and said he has access to a big container, huge container, 12 foot by 30 or 40 feet, full size. Wanted to bring it out to my property. Couldn't believe I wasn't interested in us burying it like 30 feet in the ground and putting a tunnel down into it. So when those times happen, we have a place to go. And if we have to see that 60 days, we'll have 60 days or maybe even 6 months worth of stuff. So you're going to stay down there 6 months and come out to the water. What are you going to come out to? I just simply told him I don't want to hold on to life that bad. But again, my original point is, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice of only looking from the flesh and what the flesh will experience during those times, as compared to God setting things in order and God's timetable being laid out and deliverance is right around the corner.
Thank you. We're finally going to get into Matthew and start working our way through Matthew. So that's where we're going to start next week. And it's tied into another one of these sweetened passages, kind of like Hosea. So read through that reference as well, and you'll see both comings mentioned in that passage. So it's kind of like God, every once in a while, wants to give us like this little snapshot of everything within just a few verses. And Michael is one of those. Dear Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for comments and questions that were raised. Thank you for what you are trying to reveal to us. Give us open hearts so that we might not just understand it for ourselves, but that we might share it with others. I pray the blessings on this effort that we're putting forward to the public. I pray that more will hear about it and desire to be here, that it will benefit their lives as well. Lord, I pray you bless our families, those in special needs at this time, bereavement, loss of loved ones. Pray your protection, mercy upon them. Forgive us our sins and increase our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. You guys want? Yeah, sure.